The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains as specialist Maria Santos adjusted her pack one final time. At 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she was the smallest member of the Joint Operation Team, preparing to infiltrate Taliban-controlled territory in eastern Afghanistan. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she could hide behind a tree trunk. But Maria had proven time and again that her size was an advantage rather than a limitation. The briefing had been straightforward. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was operating from a compound nestled in a valley approximately 15 miles from their forward operating base. The mission required a small, nimble team capable of moving undetected through treacherous mountain passes. Maria's unit, the 82nd Airborne's Reconnaissance Team, would provide overwatch and intelligence gathering for a Navy SEAL team tasked with the primary objective. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader, had initially expressed skepticism about including Maria in the operation. His concerns weren't rooted in prejudice but in practical considerations about the physical demands of the mission. The mountainous terrain was unforgiving, with elevation changes of thousands of feet, loose shale that could send an unwary climber tumbling down a cliff face, and weather that could shift from blazing heat to freezing cold within hours. However, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, Maria's commanding officer, had been adamant. Santos has completed more reconnaissance missions in these mountains than any other soldier in my command, she had stated firmly during the planning session. Her tracking skills are exceptional, and her knowledge of local terrain features could mean the difference between mission success and walking into an ambush. Maria had earned her reputation through 2 years of deployments in Afghanistan. Born and raised in the mountains of Colorado, she had grown up hiking, climbing, and hunting with her father, a Vietnam veteran who had taught her that survival in harsh terrain required respect for the environment and careful attention to detail. These skills had translated seamlessly to military operations. The team moved out before dawn, using night vision equipment to navigate the initial phase of their approach. Maria took point, her compact frame allowing her to move silently through areas where larger soldiers might dislodge rocks or struggle to maintain balance on narrow ledges. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold mountain air as she carefully studied the terrain ahead, looking for signs of recent human activity or potential ambush positions. Behind her, the SEAL team moved with practiced efficiency. Morrison had eventually acknowledged Maria's capabilities after watching her guide previous patrols through seemingly impossible terrain features. Petty Officer First Class David Chen, the team's medic, had worked with Maria on several occasions and had developed a deep respect for her abilities. The other team members, Petty Officer Second Class Mike Thompson and Petty Officer Third Class Alex Rivera, had initially been uncertain about working with Army personnel but had quickly recognized Maria's value to the mission. As the team progressed deeper into enemy territory, Maria's knowledge of the local terrain proved invaluable. She identified safe crossing points over rushing mountain streams that were invisible from satellite imagery, located caves where the team could take shelter during rest breaks, and most importantly, spotted signs of enemy activity that might have been missed by less experienced eyes. The first indication of trouble came when Maria noticed freshly broken vegetation along what appeared to be an old goat path. The damage was subtle, barely visible unless one knew what to look for, but it suggested that armed men had passed through the area within the last 24 hours. She signaled for the team to halt and carefully examined the area, finding additional evidence in the form of a partial boot print in soft soil and a small piece of fabric caught on a thorn bush. Morrison studied Maria's findings and agreed with her assessment. The team was likely moving parallel to an enemy patrol route, which meant they needed to adjust their approach to avoid potential contact. Maria consulted her topographical maps and identified an alternate route that would add several hours to their journey but would keep them away from likely enemy positions. The detour led the team through increasingly challenging terrain. They traversed narrow ridges with 1,000-foot drops on either side, climbed nearly vertical rock faces using ropes and climbing equipment, and navigated through a series of boulder fields where one misstep could result in serious injury. Maria's climbing experience proved essential as she secured safety lines and identified the safest routes through each obstacle. During one particularly difficult section, Thompson slipped while crossing a loose scree field and nearly fell before Chen managed to arrest his slide with a climbing rope. The near miss served as a reminder of how quickly the mountain environment could turn deadly, even for experienced special operations personnel. As evening approached, Maria identified a suitable location for the team to establish an overnight position. The site she selected was a natural depression, surrounded by large boulders, that would provide concealment from visual observation, while offering multiple escape routes if they were discovered by enemy forces. The position also provided clear lines of sight to potential approach routes, allowing the team to maintain security throughout the night. The team established a watch rotation and settled in for what they hoped would be an uneventful night. Maria used the quiet hours to study her maps and plan the next day's route to the target area. Her calculations indicated they could reach their planned observation position by mid-morning if weather conditions remained favorable. However, the mountains rarely cooperated with human plans. During the early morning hours, a sudden weather front moved through the area, bringing with it heavy snow and strong winds that reduced visibility to less than 50 meters. The storm system was unexpected, as weather forecasts had predicted clear conditions for the next 48 hours. Maria realized that the storm presented both challenges and opportunities. While the weather would make movement more difficult and potentially dangerous, it would also provide excellent concealment for their approach to the target area. Enemy sentries would be less alert during the storm, and the sound of wind and precipitation would help mask any noise the team might make during their movement. After consulting with Morrison, Maria proposed taking advantage of the storm to complete their approach ahead of schedule. Her plan involved using a series of natural terrain features that would be dangerous under normal conditions but could be navigated safely with proper techniques and equipment. The route would cut several hours off their planned timeline and position them perfectly for surveillance of the target compound. Morrison was initially hesitant, recognizing the increased risks associated with moving through difficult terrain during a snowstorm. However, Maria's confident presentation of her plan and her demonstrated expertise in mountain operations convinced him to authorize the approach. As dawn broke through the swirling snow, Maria led the team through the most challenging terrain they had yet encountered. They rappelled down ice-covered cliff faces, crossed frozen streams that threatened to give way under their weight, and navigated through narrow passes where the wind created dangerous Venturi effects that could literally blow a person off the mountain. Despite the challenging conditions, Maria's route selection proved excellent. The team reached their planned observation position 2 hours ahead of schedule, and the storm provided perfect concealment as they established their surveillance post. From their elevated position, they had clear lines of sight to the target compound and could observe enemy activity patterns without being detected. The compound was larger than intelligence reports had indicated, with multiple buildings and what appeared to be a significant number of personnel. Maria used her spotting scope to document the layout, while Morrison coordinated with higher headquarters to report their observations. The intelligence gathered during their surveillance would be critical for planning the assault phase of the mission. As the storm began to clear, Maria noticed increased activity around the compound. Enemy personnel were moving equipment and vehicles in patterns that suggested they might be preparing to relocate. If the target was planning to leave the area, the window of opportunity for the mission was rapidly closing. Morrison made the decision to accelerate the timeline for the assault. Rather than conducting extended surveillance as originally planned, the SEAL team would need to move into position for an immediate assault to prevent the target from escaping. This change meant abandoning their carefully planned routes and taking more direct approaches that carried higher risks of detection. Maria quickly identified approach routes that would allow the SEAL team to reach assault positions while maintaining the element of surprise. Her knowledge of local terrain features allowed her to spot dead ground and natural concealment that would be invisible to observers in the compound. The routes she selected would require precise navigation and careful timing, but they offered the best chance for mission success. As the team prepared to move into their assault positions, Maria felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that preceded every combat operation. She had guided the team safely through some of the most challenging mountain terrain in Afghanistan. But the next phase of the mission would test everyone's skills and training in new ways. The sun was fully up now, burning through the last wisps of storm clouds and revealing the stark beauty of the mountain landscape. In a few hours, this peaceful valley would become a battleground, and Maria's role would shift from guide to combatant. She checked her equipment one final time and prepared to follow the SEAL team into what would become the most dangerous mission of her military career. Everything that had happened up to this point had been preparation. The real test was about to begin, and Maria Santos was ready to prove that courage came in all sizes. The tiny soldier from Colorado was about to show her teammates what she was truly capable of when everything went wrong. The assault began at 0800 hours with textbook precision. Morrison's team had moved into position using Maria's carefully planned routes, and initial surveillance indicated that enemy forces were unaware of their presence. Chen had established overwatch from an elevated position, while Thompson and Rivera approached the main compound from opposite directions. Morrison coordinated the operation from a central position that allowed him to communicate with all team members. Maria had been assigned to maintain the escape route and provide early warning of enemy reinforcements. Her position on a ridgeline overlooking the valley gave her excellent visibility of all approaches to the compound, and her radio served as the communication link between the assault team and their forward operating base. The first sign that intelligence reports had been incomplete came when Thompson reported significantly more enemy personnel than expected. What was supposed to be a small compound housing a dozen fighters appeared to be a major staging area with at least 40 armed men. The target building itself was heavily fortified, with fighting positions that had not been visible from their original surveillance position. Morrison quickly assessed the situation and made the decision to proceed with the mission despite the unexpected complications. The intelligence value of the target was too high to abandon the operation, and his team had the skills and equipment necessary to handle the larger enemy force. However, the changed circumstances meant that speed and violence of action would be even more critical to mission success. The initial breach went smoothly. Rivera successfully penetrated the outer perimeter and neutralized 2 sentries without raising an alarm. Thompson reached his assigned position and reported that he had clear lines of sight to multiple target buildings. Chen confirmed that his overwatch position provided excellent coverage of the main assault routes. Morrison began his movement toward the primary target building when Maria spotted dust clouds on the access road leading to the compound. Through her spotting scope, she could see a convoy of 3 vehicles approaching rapidly from the east. Her urgent radio call warned the team that reinforcements would arrive within 10 minutes, fundamentally changing the tactical situation. The presence of incoming reinforcements meant that the team would likely be outnumbered by at least 3-1 once the convoy arrived. Morrison made the critical decision to accelerate the assault timeline and complete the primary mission before enemy reinforcements could deploy effectively. This meant abandoning careful movement techniques in favor of speed and aggressive action. What happened next would be debated in after-action reports for months. Morrison's entry into the target building triggered a complex ambush that suggested enemy forces had been aware of the approaching assault team. Explosives hidden in the building's entrance created a devastating blast that wounded Morrison severely and alerted every enemy fighter in the compound to the team's presence. Maria heard the explosion and saw smoke rising from the target building, followed immediately by intensive small arms fire as enemy forces engaged the SEAL team from multiple directions. Chen's urgent radio calls indicated that Morrison was down and required immediate medical evacuation, but the approaching convoy had now deployed and was establishing fighting positions that blocked all planned escape routes. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly, as enemy forces demonstrated a level of coordination and preparation that suggested this had been a carefully planned trap. Radio intercepts indicated that additional enemy units were being mobilized from nearby positions, meaning the team would soon face overwhelming odds even if they could extract Morrison successfully. Thompson and Rivera attempted to reach Morrison's position but were pinned down by accurate enemy fire from concealed positions. Chen could provide covering fire from his overwatch position, but the range and terrain limitations meant his effectiveness was limited. The team was effectively trapped with a seriously wounded leader and no clear route to safety. Maria realized that someone would need to reach Morrison's position and provide immediate medical attention before attempting evacuation. The most direct route to the target building required crossing approximately 200 meters of open ground under enemy observation and fire. It was a move that conventional tactical doctrine would consider suicidal, but Maria could see no alternative that would save Morrison's life. Without requesting permission or announcing her intentions, Maria began moving down the ridgeline toward the compound. Her small size and intimate knowledge of terrain features allowed her to use micro-terrain and natural concealment that would be unavailable to larger soldiers. She moved quickly but carefully, using every piece of cover and concealment to mask her approach. The enemy fighters were focused primarily on the known positions of Thompson, Rivera, and Chen, which meant they were not specifically watching for movement from Maria's direction. However, crossing the final 100 meters to Morrison's position would require moving through an area with minimal concealment and multiple enemy observation positions. Maria studied the tactical situation and identified a narrow window of opportunity. Chen was providing suppressive fire that forced enemy fighters to keep their heads down, while Thompson and Rivera were conducting coordinated fire and movement that drew attention away from her approach route. She would have perhaps 30 seconds to cross the most dangerous section of open ground. Drawing on her training and natural athletic ability, Maria sprinted across the exposed area in a series of bounds that covered ground faster than enemy gunners could adjust their aim. Bullets impacted the ground around her as she dove through the shattered entrance of the target building, but she reached Morrison's position without being hit. The scene inside the building was devastating. Morrison had absorbed the full force of the improvised explosive device and was unconscious with severe injuries to his legs and torso. Blood loss was significant, and Maria could see that he would not survive without immediate medical intervention. Her combat medical training told her that Morrison had minutes rather than hours, unless she could stabilize his condition. Working under fire in the partially collapsed building, Maria applied tourniquets to control bleeding from Morrison's leg wounds and administered morphine for pain management. She used her radio to contact Chen and request medical supplies, but the ongoing firefight made it impossible for anyone else to reach their position safely. Maria's assessment of Morrison's condition indicated that he had sustained internal injuries that required surgical intervention beyond her capabilities as a combat medic. However, she could see that basic stabilization might keep him alive long enough to reach proper medical facilities if they could somehow extract from their current position. The tactical situation outside the building continued to worsen as enemy reinforcements arrived and began coordinating their attacks more effectively. Radio traffic indicated that additional enemy units were moving to surround the compound entirely, which would eliminate any remaining escape routes within the next 30 minutes. Chen reported that his ammunition was running low and that enemy forces were beginning to locate and engage his position with direct fire. Thompson and Rivera were similarly running short on ammunition and were being pressed by increasingly aggressive enemy assaults. The team was reaching the point where continued resistance would become impossible. Maria realized that conventional extraction methods were no longer viable. The team's planned escape routes were compromised. Helicopter extraction was impossible due to enemy air defenses, and ground vehicles could not navigate the mountain terrain to reach their position. If Morrison was going to survive, someone would need to carry him out on foot through terrain that had challenged the entire team even under optimal conditions. The distance to the nearest friendly forces was approximately 8 miles through some of the most difficult mountain terrain in Afghanistan. The route would require climbing over 2 major ridgelines, crossing multiple streambeds, and navigating through areas where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall. Under normal circumstances, the journey would be challenging for a healthy, unencumbered soldier. Attempting the journey while carrying a wounded man who weighed nearly twice her body weight seemed impossible, but Maria could see no alternative. Morrison's injuries were beyond what could be treated in the field, and every minute of delay reduced his chances of survival. Someone had to make the attempt, and she was the only team member in a position to do so. Maria used her radio to coordinate with the remaining team members for a breakout attempt. Chen would provide covering fire for as long as his ammunition lasted, while Thompson and Rivera would conduct a diversionary attack to draw enemy attention away from her escape route. The plan was desperate and relied heavily on chance, but it offered the only realistic hope for saving Morrison's life. The breakout began at 0930 hours, with Chen engaging multiple enemy positions simultaneously to create maximum confusion. Thompson and Rivera launched their diversionary attack from the opposite direction, drawing enemy fire and attention toward their positions. During the few seconds of tactical advantage created by these actions, Maria began the most important movement of her military career. Morrison was unconscious but still breathing, as Maria lifted him into a fireman's carry position. The combined weight of Morrison and his equipment exceeded 200 pounds, more than Maria had ever attempted to carry over any significant distance. However, Adrenaline and determination made the load manageable as she began moving away from the compound toward the planned escape route. The initial movement was successful, as enemy forces were focused on engaging the other team members and did not immediately notice Maria's departure. She was able to reach the tree line surrounding the compound before enemy observers spotted her movement and began directing fire in her direction. Bullets cracked through the air around Maria as she struggled up the steep slope behind the compound, but the combination of rough terrain and her erratic movement pattern made accurate fire difficult for enemy gunners. She reached the first ridgeline without being hit, but the physical exertion of carrying Morrison's weight up the steep grade had already exhausted much of her initial strength. Looking back toward the compound, Maria could see that the firefight was continuing but that her teammates were being gradually overwhelmed by superior enemy numbers. Radio traffic indicated that Chen's position had been overrun and that Thompson and Rivera were conducting a fighting withdrawal toward alternate escape routes. She was now completely on her own with a critically wounded soldier and 8 miles of hostile territory between them and safety. The weight of responsibility was almost overwhelming, as Maria realized that Morrison's life depended entirely on her ability to carry him across terrain that would challenge a pack animal. However, she also knew that doubt and hesitation were luxuries she could not afford. Morrison was counting on her, and failure was not an option. Adjusting her carry position to distribute the weight more effectively, Maria began the long journey that would test every aspect of her training, experience, and personal character. Behind her, the sounds of battle gradually faded as she climbed higher into the mountains, carrying her wounded teammate toward what she hoped would be salvation. The first mile was the hardest because Maria's mind kept calculating the impossible mathematics of her situation. At her current pace, carrying Morrison's weight up steep mountain terrain, the journey to friendly forces would take at least 12 hours. Morrison's medical condition suggested he might not survive half that time without proper surgical intervention. The weight of these calculations threatened to crush her spirit before the physical burden could exhaust her body. By the time she crested the first major ridgeline, Maria had learned to push such thoughts aside and focus on immediate challenges. The slope on the far side was treacherous, covered with loose shale that threatened to send both of them tumbling hundreds of feet down the mountainside. She was forced to adopt a slow, deliberate pace that tested her balance and leg strength with each careful step. Morrison remained unconscious, which was both a blessing and a concern. His unconscious state meant he was not experiencing pain from his injuries or the rough treatment of being carried across difficult terrain. However, it also meant that Maria could not assess his condition or receive any assistance with navigation decisions. She was entirely alone with her burden and her determination. The weight distribution was becoming a serious problem. Morrison's equipment and body armor added significant bulk that made maintaining balance difficult on narrow ledges and steep slopes. Maria experimented with different carrying positions, trying to find arrangements that would allow her to maintain mobility while ensuring Morrison's safety. After 2 hours of travel, Maria was forced to acknowledge that she needed rest. Her legs were trembling with fatigue, and her breathing was becoming labored despite her excellent physical conditioning. She located a small depression between large boulders that would provide concealment and carefully lowered Morrison to the ground. Her assessment of Morrison's condition revealed that he was still breathing regularly, though his pulse was weak and his skin was cold to the touch. The tourniquets she had applied were still controlling bleeding from his leg wounds, but she could see evidence of internal bleeding that was beyond her ability to treat. Time was running out, and the journey was only just beginning. Maria consumed water and high-energy rations while studying her topographical map. Her current position was approximately 2 miles from the compound, which meant she was maintaining reasonable pace despite the difficult terrain. However, the next section of the route would require crossing a deep valley and climbing an even steeper ridgeline on the far side. The descent into the valley was treacherous, requiring Maria to brace against rocks and trees while controlling her speed to prevent losing balance. Morrison's weight threatened to pull her forward down the steep slope, and several times she was forced to stop and readjust her grip to maintain control. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cold mountain air, and her muscles burned with the constant strain. At the bottom of the valley, Maria discovered that the stream she needed to cross was much deeper and faster moving than indicated on her maps. Recent snowmelt had turned what should have been a shallow creek into a rushing torrent that would be dangerous to cross even without carrying a wounded soldier. The water was ice cold and the current was strong enough to sweep away anyone who lost their footing. Maria spent precious minutes searching for a safe crossing point, knowing that every delay reduced Morrison's chances of survival. She finally located a fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across the narrowest section of the stream. The log was wet and slippery, but it offered the only realistic option for crossing without exposing Morrison to the dangerous current. Carrying Morrison across the improvised bridge required every technique Maria had learned during her childhood climbing adventures in Colorado. She moved slowly and deliberately, testing each step before committing her weight. Her boots slipped twice on the wet bark, but she managed to maintain balance and reach the far side without falling into the freezing water. The climb out of the valley was even more demanding than the descent. The slope was nearly vertical in some sections, requiring Maria to use her hands for balance while somehow maintaining her grip on Morrison. Her shoulders and back screamed with pain as she fought against gravity and exhaustion to gain elevation, one painful step at a time. 3 hours into the journey, Maria began experiencing the first signs of serious dehydration and fatigue. Her hands were shaking, making it difficult to maintain a secure grip on Morrison's equipment. Her legs felt weak and unsteady, threatening to give way on the steep terrain. Most concerning, she was beginning to make small navigation errors that could lead them away from safety. During her next rest stop, Maria forced herself to consume more water and food despite her lack of appetite. She knew that her physical condition was critical not only to her own survival but to Morrison's as well. If she collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration, both of them would die on the mountain. Morrison stirred briefly during this rest period, opening his eyes and attempting to speak. His words were unclear, but Maria could see recognition in his eyes and knew that he was aware of their situation. She spoke to him quietly, explaining their position and assuring him that they would reach safety. Morrison's brief moment of consciousness was encouraging, but Maria could see that he was growing weaker. The 4th hour brought new challenges as the terrain became increasingly technical. Maria found herself negotiating cliff bands and narrow ledges that would have been difficult even without carrying Morrison's weight. Her climbing experience was essential, as she identified safe routes and proper techniques for maintaining 3 points of contact while managing her burden. On one particularly exposed section, Maria was forced to traverse a narrow ledge with a 1,000-foot drop directly below. The ledge was barely wide enough for one person, and carrying Morrison required her to move sideways while pressing against the rock face for balance. Her heart pounded as she inched across the exposure, knowing that a single mistake would be fatal for both of them. By the 5th hour, Maria's physical condition was becoming critical. Her hands were cramped from maintaining her grip on Morrison's equipment, and her legs were barely supporting her weight on the steep terrain. She was moving more slowly now, forced to rest every few hundred meters to prevent complete collapse. The psychological challenges were becoming as difficult as the physical ones. The enormity of what she was attempting threatened to overwhelm her determination. 8 miles had seemed impossible at the beginning of the journey, and she had covered barely half that distance after 5 hours of maximum effort. Morrison's condition was deteriorating, and her own energy reserves were nearly exhausted. It was during her darkest moment of doubt that Maria heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the mountain valleys. The sound was faint and intermittent, carried by shifting wind patterns, but it represented the first evidence that rescue forces might be searching for them. The possibility of salvation renewed her determination and gave her the strength to continue. Maria adjusted her route to move toward higher ground, where they would be more visible to aircraft. The change in direction required climbing an additional ridgeline that she had hoped to avoid, but the potential for rescue made the extra effort worthwhile. Every step was agony now, but the sound of helicopters provided motivation that transcended physical pain. The 6th hour brought Maria to the edge of complete physical exhaustion. Her movements were slow and deliberate, conserving every ounce of remaining energy for the most critical tasks. She had long since stopped checking her map, relying instead on general navigation toward the direction where friendly forces were located. Morrison's breathing was becoming irregular, and Maria could see that his skin was taking on a grayish pallor that indicated severe blood loss. She administered her last morphine injection and adjusted his position to ensure his airway remained clear, but she knew that medical intervention was needed immediately if he was going to survive. It was then that Maria saw the rescue helicopter approaching from the east, flying a search pattern that suggested the crew was looking for survivors from the failed mission. She immediately began signaling with her signal mirror, reflecting sunlight toward the aircraft to attract the crew's attention. The helicopter was still several miles away, but Maria could see that it was moving in her general direction. The helicopter crew spotted Maria's signal mirror and began flying directly toward her position. As the aircraft approached, Maria could see that it was a medical evacuation helicopter equipped with specialized rescue equipment. The crew would be able to provide immediate medical care for Morrison and transport both of them to safety. However, the terrain where Maria had stopped was unsuitable for helicopter landing. The ridge was too narrow and steep for the aircraft to touch down safely, which meant that rescue would require a more complex operation. Maria watched as the helicopter circled her position, with the crew assessing options for extracting 2 people from the difficult terrain. The solution came in the form of a hoist operation. The helicopter positioned itself above Maria's location, while a rescue specialist was lowered on a cable to her position. The specialist, a Navy corpsman trained in mountain rescue techniques, quickly assessed Morrison's condition and began preparing him for evacuation. Within minutes, Morrison was secured in a rescue basket and lifted into the helicopter, where medical personnel immediately began providing advanced life support. Maria was then lifted to safety using a rescue harness, ending her 8-mile journey that had taken nearly 7 hours of maximum effort across some of the most challenging terrain in Afghanistan. As the helicopter flew toward the nearest medical facility, Maria learned that Thompson, Rivera, and Chen had successfully escaped from the compound and had been rescued by a separate team. Morrison's chances for survival were good despite his serious injuries, thanks largely to Maria's quick medical intervention and her determination to carry him to safety. The official after-action reports would document the tactical details of the failed assault and the successful rescue operation. However, the true story of the mission was not found in radio transcripts or casualty reports, but in the courage of a small soldier who refused to abandon a wounded teammate regardless of the personal cost. Maria Santos had proven that heroism was not measured in size or strength, but in the willingness to sacrifice everything for others. Her 8-mile journey across the Hindu Kush Mountains would become legendary within the special operations community, inspiring countless others to push beyond their perceived limitations when lives were on the line. Morrison recovered fully from his injuries and returned to active duty 6 months later. He would never forget the soldier who carried him to safety when everyone else thought the situation was hopeless. Maria's actions that day demonstrated the finest traditions of military service and the unbreakable bonds that exist between soldiers who face danger together. The tiny female soldier had hauled an injured SEAL 8 miles across the mountains, and in doing so, she had saved not only Morrison's life but had proven that courage comes in all sizes. Her story would be retold in military academies and training schools as an example of determination, selflessness, and the extraordinary things that ordinary people can accomplish when faced with impossible circumstances.